Okay, so we're going over detente right now. Detente, which is spelled Detente, is Nixon's policy towards communism, which is pretty much containment, but Nixon's a little bit more mature, I guess, and so he's actually going to go and meet with the leaders of the Soviet Union and China instead of just ignoring them. So 4 minutes.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
By the time Richard Nixon reached the White House in 1969, the Cold War had been underway for more than 2 decades. The superpowers had reached a crossroads. They could continue the saber-rattling and confrontations that threatened to plunge the world into nuclear war. Or they could agree to disagree and seek areas of mutual interest. In 1969, they chose the latter, and a decade of relative calm in the Cold War began. In Europe, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt called it Ostpolitik. In the United States, Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called it Detente. It did not end the Cold War, but it created a framework for cooperation among the rivals. In 1972, President Nixon embarked on a diplomatic trip that came to symbolize detente. When he touched down at Capitol Airport near Peking, Nixon became the first American president to be welcomed in the Communist People's Republic of China.
Since 1949, when it became communist, okay? America has a long history of just ignoring countries that go communist. For example, Cuba. We didn't speak to Cuba from 61 until 15. Okay, so Nixon goes and reaches out to China. This event is in Forrest Gump 2. When he's ping pong champion of the world or whatever, he goes to China. He's the first person that had been to China since 49.
It was a historic opening in the Cold War. During a week of diplomacy and cultural exchange, 2 former enemies made great progress toward normalizing relations. Not to be outdone, Soviet Union reached out to the West as well. Chairman Leonid Brezhnev saw detente as an opportunity to gain access to valuable foreign aid and open its borders to international trade.
That's interesting because foreign trade is an example of what type of economy? Capitalism. Capitalism is the complete opposite of communism, which is the economic system in the Soviet Union. So you can already see how it's starting to crack. Okay, this is like in 1970. I think it's 1969 is when they go in and see the Chinese. And so even in the late 60s, it's already starting to collapse, and eventually it will collapse in 89 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
In May 1972, the Kremlin in Moscow played host to the American president. Together, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the first ever agreements to limit nuclear weapons. The SALT I and ABM treaties were largely symbolic, but they represented a mutual effort to work towards cooperation and coexistence.
SALT and SALT II, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Treaties. These are treaties that have to deal with lessening the amount of nuclear weapons that we had. SALT and SALT II are agreements with the Soviet Union to decrease, to lower, to lessen the amount of nuclear weapons that we both had.
President Nixon appealed to the Soviet people and their leaders.
As we look at the prospects for peace, we see that we have made significant progress at reducing the possible sources of direct conflict between us. But history tells us that great nations have often been dragged into war without intending it by conflicts between smaller nations. As great powers, we can and should use our influence to prevent this from happening. Our Our goal should be to discourage aggression in other parts of the world, and particularly among those smaller nations that look to us for leadership and example. With great power goes great responsibility.
Nixon's peace was soon overshadowed by the intrigue and cover-ups of the Watergate scandal.
Some of these events in 1969 and 1970 included intensive harassment of political candidates.
Congressional hearings revealed that the president and his staff had waged an illegal war against their political opponents, members of the media, leaders of the anti-war movement. Crimes had been committed. Congress threatened impeachment. For Nixon, it was the end of the line.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, and so that was Detente, which was Richard Nixon's foreign policy. Without a doubt, the most corrupt president we've ever had, Richard Milhouse Nixon. That bottle.